The sheriff's boots echoed against the wooden planks of the saloon as he pinned the eviction notice to the bulletin board, and Grace Keller felt her entire world shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. She stood frozen at the bar, her fingers wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey that suddenly felt too heavy to hold. The paper fluttered slightly in the draft from the open door, but the words remained brutally clear, even from across the room. Grace Keller was hereby ordered to vacate the town of Challis, Idaho by sunrise on account of moral turpitude and disturbing the peace. The date read August 15, 1882, and it might as well have been her death sentence. "You cannot be serious," Grace said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence that had fallen over the saloon. Every patron had turned to watch the confrontation unfold, their faces a mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude. "What exactly have I done to deserve banishment?" Sheriff Mitchell turned slowly, his weathered face impassive beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "You know exactly what you have done, Miss Keller. You have been running poker games in the back room, taking money from honest men, and causing fights to break out nearly every night this week. The town council has voted, and the decision is final. You have until sunrise tomorrow to pack your belongings and leave Challis." Grace felt her cheeks burn with indignation. "Those men came to my games willingly. I never forced anyone to sit at my table, and if they cannot handle losing a few hands of cards, that is hardly my fault. As for the fights, perhaps you should spend less time harassing women who are simply trying to make an honest living and more time controlling the drunken fools who cannot hold their liquor." The sheriff's jaw tightened, and Grace knew she had pushed too far. But she was tired of being blamed for the shortcomings of men who could not accept that a woman could outsmart them at cards. She had come to Challis 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a keen mind for mathematics. Poker had been her salvation, her way of earning enough money to rent a small room above the general store and keep food in her belly. The fact that she was good at it should not have been a crime. "The decision stands," Sheriff Mitchell said coldly. "Sunrise, Miss Keller. If you are still in town when the sun comes up, I will personally escort you to the jail, and you can spend a few weeks in a cell thinking about your behavior before I put you on a horse and send you on your way." He turned on his heel and walked out of the saloon, leaving Grace standing alone with dozens of eyes still fixed upon her. She took a long drink of her whiskey, finishing it in one burning gulp, and set the glass down on the bar with more force than necessary. "Well, I suppose that is that," she muttered to no one in particular. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who had always been kind to her, leaned across the bar and lowered his voice. "There might be a way around it, you know." Grace looked up sharply. "What are you talking about?" Pete glanced around to make sure no one was listening too closely. "The law says unmarried women of questionable character can be run out of town. But married women, they have rights. They cannot be forced to leave unless their husbands agree to it." Grace stared at him. "Are you suggesting I get married in the next 12 hours? That is insane. Even if I wanted to, which I do not, where exactly would I find a man willing to marry a woman he barely knows just to circumvent a town ordinance?" Pete shrugged. "I am just saying, it is an option. There are plenty of lonely cowboys in this town who would jump at the chance to have a pretty wife, even if the circumstances are unusual." Grace shook her head and pushed away from the bar. The idea was preposterous. She had not survived this long on her own just to throw away her independence by shackling herself to some stranger, who would probably expect her to cook and clean and bear his children while he drank away whatever money she managed to earn. No, she would pack her belongings and leave town as ordered. She had done it before, and she could do it again. The walk back to her room above the general store felt longer than usual. The evening air was cool against her skin, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat that had baked the town all day. Challis sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, and while the days could be brutally hot in summer, the nights often brought a chill that seeped into your bones. Grace climbed the narrow stairs to her room and lit the oil lamp on the small table beside her bed. The room was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden chest for her clothes, a wash basin and pitcher, and the table with its lamp. She had a few books stacked on the floor, novels she had read so many times she could recite passages from memory, and a small leather bag that held her savings. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to calculate how much money she had and how far it would take her. Montana, perhaps, or Wyoming. Somewhere she could start over again. Find another town where the men would not mind losing money to a woman until they inevitably did mind, and she would have to move on once more. It was exhausting, this constant cycle of arriving and departing, of building something small and fragile only to have it torn away. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Grace stood and opened it cautiously, half expecting Sheriff Mitchell to be standing there to harass her further. Instead, she found herself face to face with a tall cowboy she recognized from the saloon. He had been there earlier, sitting at a corner table nursing a beer and watching the confrontation unfold. "Miss Keller," he said, removing his hat politely. "My name is James Yates. I wonder if I might have a word with you." Grace studied him warily. James Yates had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, warm brown eyes that seemed kind despite the hardness the frontier life had carved into his features, and a quiet confidence in the way he held himself. She guessed he was somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. He wore the typical attire of a working cowboy, dusty trousers, a worn shirt, and leather chaps that showed signs of long hours in the saddle. "What do you want?" Grace asked, not unkindly but not inviting him in either. "I heard about your situation," James said, "and I have a proposal I would like you to consider." Grace felt her stomach drop. If this is about Pete's ridiculous suggestion that I should marry someone to avoid being run out of town, you can save your breath. I am not that desperate. James held up a hand. "Please, just hear me out. I am not some lonely fool looking for a wife to warm my bed. I have my own reasons for needing to get married, reasons that have nothing to do with romance or companionship." Despite herself, Grace was intrigued. "What reasons?" James glanced down the hallway as if checking to make sure they were alone. "My uncle passed away 3 months ago and left me his ranch about 5 miles outside of town. It is a good piece of land, decent water rights, and a sturdy house. But there is a condition in his will. I have to be married within 6 months of his death, or the property goes to his business partner, a man named Silas Cortland who has been trying to get his hands on that land for years." "Why would your uncle include such a strange condition?" Grace asked. James gave a bitter laugh. "My uncle was a traditional man who believed a ranch needed a family to run it properly. He did not approve of my solitary lifestyle and thought this would force me to settle down. I have been putting off dealing with it, hoping I could find some loophole, but the deadline is approaching fast. September 15th. If I am not married by then, I lose everything." Grace leaned against the doorframe. "So you are looking for a wife of convenience, just as I would be looking for a husband of convenience. That still does not explain why you think I would agree to this." "Because we both need something from each other," James said simply. "You need a way to stay in Challis, and I need a wife to claim my inheritance. We could marry tonight, satisfy both requirements, and then live separate lives. You could keep running your poker games and I would work the ranch." We would not have to pretend to be a loving couple or share a bed or any of that. Just a legal arrangement between two people who understand that sometimes survival requires unconventional solutions. Grace wanted to dismiss the idea immediately, but she found herself hesitating. There was a practical logic to what James was proposing. Marriage would indeed allow her to stay in Challis, and if James was telling the truth about wanting a platonic arrangement, she would not be giving up much beyond her legal independence. And the truth was, she was tired. Tired of running, tired of starting over, tired of fighting for every scrap of dignity and respect. "What happens if one of us wants to end the arrangement?" Grace asked. James shrugged. "We would deal with that when and if it happens. I am not going to hold you prisoner, Miss Keller. If you decide you want to leave, I would not stop you. But you would have to wait until after September 15th, because I need to be married when that deadline arrives." "That is only a month away," Grace observed. "Exactly. 1 month, and then if you want an annulment or a divorce, we can discuss it. But in the meantime, you get to stay in Challis and I get to keep my uncle's ranch. It seems like a fair trade to me." Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was crazy. She barely knew this man, and now she was actually considering marrying him based on a conversation that had lasted less than 5 minutes. But what other choice did she have? Leave town and wander until she found another place that would tolerate her until it did not? Or take a chance on this strange arrangement and at least have a roof over her head and some legal protection? "How do I know you are telling the truth about any of this?" Grace asked, opening her eyes to meet his gaze directly. "How do I know you are not just looking for a wife you can control and abuse?" James met her stare without flinching. "You do not know, and I cannot prove my intentions beyond my word. But I can tell you this. I saw you stand up to Sheriff Mitchell tonight, and I saw the way you refused to be cowed by him or anyone else in that saloon. You have spirit and courage, and those are qualities I respect. I have no interest in breaking your spirit or controlling you. I just want to keep the land my uncle left me, and you need a legal loophole to avoid being run out of town. That is all this is." Grace studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or malice. All she saw was a quiet sincerity and a weariness that matched her own. James Yates looked like a man who had been beaten down by life, but was still fighting to hold on to what little he had left. She understood that feeling all too well. "If I agree to this," Grace said slowly, "there will be rules. I will not be treated as your property. I will continue to do as I please within reason, and I will keep any money I earn. You will not dictate my behavior or try to change who I am." "Agreed," James said immediately. "And if at any point I feel unsafe or threatened, the arrangement ends regardless of your deadline." "Agreed. And we are clear that this is strictly a business arrangement. No expectations of intimacy or wifely duties beyond what is necessary to maintain the legal fiction." James nodded. "Completely clear. You have my word, Miss Keller." Grace took another deep breath and made her decision. "All right. I will marry you, but we do this properly, with a preacher and witnesses, so there can be no question about the legality of it." A look of relief crossed James's face. "Thank you. I know this is not what either of us expected when we woke up this morning, but I think we can make it work." "We had better," Grace said dryly, "because if this goes wrong, we are both going to look like fools." James smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him. "I have been called worse things than a fool, Miss Keller. Now we should get moving. We need to find a preacher willing to perform a midnight wedding, and we need to do it before anyone realizes what we are planning." Grace grabbed her shawl from the hook by the door and followed James down the stairs and out into the street. The town was quiet at this hour, most businesses closed for the night, and only a few lanterns burning in windows here and there. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a silvery glow that made the world feel dreamlike and unreal. They walked quickly toward the small church at the edge of town, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Grace felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement bubbling up in her chest. This was either the smartest or the stupidest thing she had ever done, and she would not know which until it was too late to turn back. The church was a simple wooden structure with a modest steeple and a cross mounted above the door. Light flickered in one of the windows, suggesting that someone was still awake inside. James knocked firmly, and after a moment the door opened to reveal an elderly man in a nightshirt and robe, holding a candle. "James Yates," the preacher said, surprise evident in his voice. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Good evening, Reverend Paulson," James said. "I apologize for the late visit, but I need your help with an urgent matter. This is Miss Grace Keller, and we would like you to marry us tonight." Reverend Paulson's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Marry you?" "Tonight, my boy, marriage is a sacred institution, not something to be rushed into on a whim. Perhaps you should take some time to pray and reflect on this decision." "With all due respect, Reverend, we do not have time," Grace interjected. "I am being forced to leave town by sunrise unless I can prove I have a legal right to stay. Marriage would provide that right, and James has agreed to help me." The Reverend looked between them, his expression troubled. "I see. And you are both certain this is what you want?" "Marriage is meant to be a lifelong commitment, blessed by God and entered into with pure hearts." "We understand the seriousness of what we are asking," James said, "and we are both willing to make those vows before God and any witnesses you require. Please, Reverend." "We would not be here if we had any other option." Reverend Paulson sighed heavily. "Very well. Give me a moment to dress properly, and I will meet you inside the chapel. But I want you both to understand that once these vows are spoken, they cannot be easily undone. You will be bound together in the eyes of the Lord and the law." "We understand," Grace said firmly. The Reverend disappeared back into his small living quarters adjacent to the church, leaving Grace and James standing in the entryway. Grace could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and her hands were trembling slightly. James must have noticed because he gently touched her elbow. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am fine," Grace lied. "Just nervous. This is not exactly how I imagined my wedding day would go." James gave her a sympathetic look. "I know. If it helps, this is not how I imagined mine either, but we are doing what we need to do to survive, and there is no shame in that." Reverend Paulson returned a few minutes later, now properly dressed in his ministerial robes. He led them into the small chapel, which was dimly lit by a few candles on the altar. The space smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the silence felt heavy and expectant. "We will need witnesses," the Reverend said. "Let me wake my wife and my assistant. They can serve." While they waited, Grace stood beside James in front of the altar, acutely aware of how strange this all was. She was about to marry a man she had spoken to for less than an hour, a man she knew almost nothing about beyond his name and his desperate need to claim an inheritance. And yet, despite the absurdity of the situation, she felt oddly calm. James Yates did not seem like a bad man, and his proposal had been straightforward and honest. That was more than she could say for most of the men she had encountered in her life. Reverend Paulson returned with a sleepy-looking woman who must have been his wife and a young man who introduced himself as Timothy, the church assistant. They took their places as witnesses, and the Reverend opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice solemn and formal, "we are gathered here tonight in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is an honorable estate, instituted by God, and is not to be entered into lightly or unadvisedly." Grace barely heard the words. Her mind was racing, thinking about everything that had happened in the past few hours and everything that was about to change. She was going to be married. She was going to be Mrs. James Yates, a name she had not even known this morning. It felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold rather than her own. "James Yates," the Reverend continued, "you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part." James looked at Grace, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw determination there and something else she could not quite name. "I do," he said clearly. "Grace Keller, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Grace swallowed hard. This was it. The moment of no return. She thought about Sheriff Mitchell's smug face as he had pinned that eviction notice to the bulletin board. She thought about all the times she had been pushed around and dismissed and forced to move on, because she dared to be a woman who refused to fit into the mold society had carved out for her. And she thought about the opportunity James was offering her, a chance to stay and fight instead of run. "I do," Grace said, her voice steady and strong. "You have rings to exchange?" the Reverend asked. James shook his head. "No, I am afraid not. This was rather sudden." "Very well. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Idaho and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The Reverend closed his Bible and looked at them gravely. "You may kiss your bride if you wish." James and Grace stood there awkwardly for a moment. Finally, James leaned forward and placed a chaste, brief kiss on her cheek. It was the first time they had touched beyond his hand on her elbow, and Grace felt an unexpected warmth spread through her at the contact. "Congratulations," Reverend Paulson said, though he still looked troubled. "I pray that God will bless your union and guide you both in the days ahead." "Thank you, Reverend," James said. "We appreciate your help tonight." They signed the marriage certificate, with Mrs. Paulson and Timothy adding their names as witnesses. Grace stared at her new signature, Grace Yates, and felt a strange disconnection from the woman who had written those words. Who was Grace Yates? She had been Grace Keller for 24 years, and now, in the span of 15 minutes, she had become someone else entirely. As they left the church and stepped back out into the cool night air, Grace realized that the clock had struck midnight. She was now a married woman, and when Sheriff Mitchell came looking for her at sunrise, he would find that his eviction order was no longer valid. "We should probably tell the sheriff sooner rather than later," James suggested as they walked back toward the center of town. "That way, there is no confusion in the morning." Grace nodded. "His office is just down the street. Let us get this over with." The sheriff's office was dark, but they could see light coming from the window of the small apartment above it where Sheriff Mitchell lived. James picked up a stone and tossed it at the window, and after a moment the sheriff's face appeared, scowling down at them. "What in blazes do you want at this hour?" he shouted. "Sheriff Mitchell, I need to inform you of a change in circumstances regarding your eviction order," Grace called up to him. The sheriff's scowl deepened. "What are you talking about, Miss Keller?" "It is Mrs. Yates now," Grace said, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from her voice. "James Yates and I were married tonight by Reverend Paulson, with proper witnesses and a legal certificate. As a married woman, I believe I am no longer subject to your order to leave town." For a long moment, Sheriff Mitchell just stared at them. Then his face turned an impressive shade of red. "You did what?" "We got married," James repeated calmly. "Which means my wife has every right to remain in Challis, unless you would like to take the matter up with Reverend Paulson and accuse him of performing an illegal ceremony." The sheriff sputtered for a moment, clearly trying to find some argument that would allow him to maintain his authority. Finally, he said, "This is not over. I will be speaking to the town council about this." "You do that," Grace said sweetly. "But in the meantime, I will be staying exactly where I am. Good night, Sheriff." They walked away before he could respond, and Grace felt a giddy sense of triumph bubbling up inside her. She had beaten them. She had found a way to stay, to keep her independence, to refuse to be pushed around. It felt glorious. "That went well," James observed with a hint of amusement in his voice. "He looked like he was about to have an apoplexy," Grace said, and then she started to laugh. It was partly relief and partly the sheer absurdity of the situation, but once she started, she could not stop. James joined in, and for a few moments they stood in the middle of the dark street, two strangers who had just gotten married laughing like old friends. When they finally caught their breath, James said, "So, what happens now? Do you want to stay in your room above the general store, or would you prefer to come out to the ranch?" Grace considered. "I think I should probably come to the ranch, at least for appearances. If we are supposed to be married, it would look odd if I continued living separately right from the start. People will talk enough as it is." "That is probably wise," James agreed. "The ranch is not fancy, but there is a spare bedroom you can use, and I promise I will respect your privacy." "I appreciate that," Grace said. "Let me go pack my things and we can leave whenever you are ready." They climbed back up to her room, and Grace quickly gathered her meager belongings into a worn carpet bag. It did not take long since she did not own much. Her clothes, her books, her savings, and a few personal items that held sentimental value. Within 20 minutes, she was ready to go. James had a horse tied up outside the general store, a sturdy bay mare who regarded Grace with calm, intelligent eyes. "Her name is Rosie," James said as he helped Grace mount up behind him. "She is even-tempered and reliable, two qualities I value highly." "Sounds like you picked a better horse than a wife," Grace joked as she settled herself on the saddle, her arms wrapped around James's waist to keep from falling off. "I am sure you have your own admirable qualities," James replied, and Grace was surprised to hear genuine warmth in his voice. "Besides, I have only known Rosie for 3 years. Give yourself time, and maybe you will prove just as reliable." They rode out of town under the watchful gaze of the full moon, heading south along a well-worn dirt road. The night was peaceful, with only the sound of Rosie's hooves and the occasional call of a night bird breaking the silence. Grace found herself relaxing against James's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the solid warmth of his body. After about half an hour, they turned off the main road onto a smaller path that led up into the foothills. Grace could see a cluster of buildings ahead, silhouetted against the starry sky. As they drew closer, she could make out a decent-sized ranch house, a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings. It was more substantial than she had expected, and she felt a flicker of hope that maybe this arrangement would not be so bad after all. James helped her down from the horse and led her toward the house while he took care of Rosie. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall and simple wooden furniture arranged around it. Everything was neat and clean, but clearly lived in by a man who had better things to do than worry about decorative touches. "The spare bedroom is through there," James said, pointing to a door on the left side of the room. "My room is on the right. There is a pump out back for water, and the outhouse is about 20 yards behind the barn. I know it is not luxurious, but it is solid and safe." Grace set down her carpetbag and looked around. "It is fine, James. Better than fine, actually. I have stayed in much worse places." James nodded. "I am glad you think so. Listen, I know today has been overwhelming for both of us. Why do not you get some rest, and we can talk more in the morning about how we want this arrangement to work?" "That sounds like a good idea," Grace agreed. She was suddenly aware of how exhausted she felt, the adrenaline that had been keeping her going finally starting to drain away. "Good night then, Grace," James said, and the use of her first name felt strangely intimate despite everything they had already been through together. "Good night, James." Grace took her bag into the spare bedroom and closed the door behind her. The room was small but comfortable, with a proper bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the dark landscape. She changed into her nightgown and crawled under the quilts, her mind still racing despite her body's desperate need for sleep. She was married. She was Grace Yates now, the wife of a cowboy she barely knew, living on a ranch she had never seen before tonight. It should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not running. She was not hiding. She was exactly where she chose to be, on her own terms, with a partner who seemed to understand that she needed her freedom more than she needed his protection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She was certain of that. The townspeople would gossip. Sheriff Mitchell would try to find some way to cause trouble, and she and James would have to figure out how to live together as strangers pretending to be husband and wife. But tonight, in this moment, Grace allowed herself to simply be grateful. Grateful for James's unexpected offer, grateful for a chance to stay in Challis, and grateful that sometimes, against all odds, things worked out. She fell asleep with that thought, and for the first time in months she did not dream of running. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving around in the main room. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or why her bed felt different. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up abruptly, her heart racing. She was at James's ranch. She was married. This was her life now. Grace dressed quickly in a simple cotton dress and brushed her hair, pinning it up in a practical style. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found James standing at the stove, frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I hope you slept well. Coffee is on the table if you want some." "Thank you," Grace said, pouring herself a cup from the enamel pot. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly the way she liked it. "You did not have to cook for me." "I am perfectly capable of making my own breakfast." "I know," James said, "but I was already up, and it seemed silly not to make enough for both of us. Besides, we should probably establish some kind of routine if we are going to be living together." He served the eggs onto 2 plates along with some bread and brought them to the table. They sat across from each other, and for a few minutes they ate in companionable silence. Grace found herself studying James in the morning light, noticing details she had missed the night before. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow, his hands were calloused from hard work, and there was a gentleness in the way he moved that contradicted the rough exterior of a frontier cowboy. "So," James said finally, "we should probably discuss how this is going to work." "I meant what I said last night about respecting your independence, but there are going to be expectations from the community. People are going to want to see us acting like a married couple, at least in public." Grace nodded. "I understand. We will need to present a united front, especially with Sheriff Mitchell looking for any excuse to cause trouble. What do you suggest?" "Well, for starters, you should probably come into town with me on Saturdays when I go in for supplies. We can be seen together, maybe have dinner at the hotel restaurant, that sort of thing. It does not have to be elaborate, just enough to establish that we are a legitimate married couple." "That seems reasonable," Grace said. "What about my poker games? I am not going to give those up." James took a sip of his coffee. "I would not ask you to, but maybe you could host them here instead of at the saloon. That way it looks more respectable, like you are entertaining guests in your own home rather than running a gambling operation in a public establishment." Grace considered this. "That could actually work, and it would give me more control over who plays and how much they drink. I might even make more money without having to give Pete a cut of my winnings." "There you go," James said with a slight smile. "See, we can make this arrangement work for both of us." They spent the rest of breakfast discussing practical matters like chores, finances, and how to handle questions from curious neighbors. Grace was impressed by how reasonable James was being about everything. He did not try to dictate terms or assert his authority as her husband. Instead, he treated her as an equal partner in this strange business arrangement they had entered into. After breakfast, James showed her around the ranch properly. The property consisted of about 200 acres of grazing land with a creek running through it, providing reliable water for the cattle. James currently had a herd of about 50 head, which he explained was modest but manageable for one person to handle. "My uncle started with nothing and built this place over 30 years, James told her as they walked along the fence line. "He taught me everything I know about ranching when I was younger. I worked for him every summer from the time I was 12 until I turned 20 and decided to strike out on my own. That did not work out so well, which is why I came back when he got sick. I helped him run the place for the last year of his life, and I was hoping he would just leave it to me outright. Instead, he added that ridiculous marriage clause." "Why did you strike out on your own if you were learning so much here?" Grace asked. James was quiet for a moment. "I was young and stupid and thought I knew better than everyone else. I went to Montana, tried to start my own ranch and lost everything in a bad winter. Froze to death half my herd, could not pay my debts, and ended up having to sell what little I had left just to avoid being thrown in jail. It was humbling to say the least. But you learned from it," Grace observed. "I did," James agreed. "I learned that pride comes before a fall and that sometimes accepting help is not the same as admitting weakness. My uncle took me back without a word of reproach, and I will always be grateful to him for that, which is why I am determined not to let Silas Cortland take this place. My uncle would turn over in his grave if that happened." "Tell me about Silas," Grace said. "What makes him so determined to get this land?" James's expression darkened. "Silas is a businessman, not a rancher. He owns the feed store in town and several other properties, and he has been buying up land around here for years. He wants to control as much of the valley as possible so he can dictate prices and push out anyone who will not play by his rules. My uncle refused to sell to him repeatedly, which made Silas furious. Now he thinks he is going to get the ranch through the terms of the will, and I will be damned if I let that happen." Grace could hear the passion in James's voice, and she understood it. This was not just about property or money. It was about legacy and honor and refusing to let a bully win. She respected that. They spent the rest of the morning working around the ranch. James needed to check on the cattle, and Grace decided to make herself useful by cleaning the house and organizing the kitchen. She found a surprising amount of satisfaction in the simple domestic tasks, perhaps because she was choosing to do them rather than being forced into the role of housekeeper. Around noon, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. James went to the door and looked out, then turned back to Grace with a wry expression. "Looks like we have visitors already. Word must have spread fast." Grace joined him at the door and saw a wagon pulling up with an older couple seated on the bench. The man had white hair and a weathered face, while the woman was plump and matronly with kind eyes. "That is the Harmons," James said quietly. "They own the ranch to the north. Good people, but Martha Harmon is the biggest gossip in 3 counties. Grace straightened her shoulders. "Then I suppose we should give her something worth gossiping about." Before James could respond, Grace slipped her hand into his and gave it a gentle squeeze. James looked surprised but recovered quickly, squeezing back. Together, they walked out to greet their visitors, presenting the picture of a happily married couple. "James," Martha Harmon called out as her husband helped her down from the wagon. "We heard the most astonishing news this morning, and I told Harold we simply had to come over and see if it was true." "Did you really get married last night?" "I did indeed, Mrs. Harmon," James said with a smile. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Grace." Martha's eyes went wide as she took in Grace, clearly recognizing her from town. "My goodness. Well, this is certainly unexpected. How did you two even meet?" "We met in town," Grace said smoothly, "and I suppose you could say it was love at first sight. When James proposed, I simply could not say no. It was a complete fabrication, of course, but Martha seemed to eat it up. How romantic! A whirlwind courtship, just like something out of a novel. And here I thought you were a confirmed bachelor, James Yates." "I thought so too," James said, looking at Grace with surprising warmth. "But then Grace came along and changed my mind about a lot of things." They invited the Harmons inside for coffee and cake, which Grace hastily prepared using supplies she found in the pantry. Martha peppered them with questions about the wedding, how they had fallen in love, and what their plans were for the future. Grace and James managed to navigate the interrogation with a mixture of vague answers and carefully constructed half-truths. By the time the Harmons left an hour later, Grace was exhausted from the performance. As soon as the wagon disappeared down the road, she collapsed into a chair and let out a long breath. "That was more difficult than facing Sheriff Mitchell," she said. James laughed. "Martha means well, but she does love to stick her nose into everyone's business. Still, you handled it beautifully. I almost believed our story myself." Grace looked up at him. "You played your part well too. Thank you for not making me feel like a fool." "Why would I do that?" James asked, his expression genuinely confused. "We are in this together, Grace. Partners, remember, partners," Grace repeated, and she found herself smiling. "I like the sound of that." Over the next few days, Grace and James fell into a comfortable routine. James would wake early to tend to the ranch work, while Grace would handle the house and prepare meals. In the afternoons, she would often join him outside, learning about the cattle and the land. She was surprised by how much she enjoyed the physical labor and the simplicity of ranch life. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. Grace learned that James had a wry sense of humor and a deep love for the land that bordered on poetic. He learned that Grace had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a failed businessman who had drunk himself to death when she was 17. She had been on her own ever since, moving from town to town, doing whatever work she could find to survive. "How did you learn to play poker so well?" James asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the mountains. "My father taught me," Grace said. "It was one of the few useful things he ever did. He was terrible at cards himself, but he understood the mathematics of it, and he passed that knowledge on to me. After he died, I realized I could use that skill to make money. It was not respectable, but it kept me fed and clothed." "There is no shame in survival," James said quietly. "You did what you had to do." "Not everyone sees it that way," Grace replied. "Most people think I am a fallen woman, morally corrupt because I dare to use my intelligence to outwit men at their own games." "Then most people are fools," James said firmly. You are one of the strongest, most resourceful people I have ever met, Grace. I am grateful you agreed to this arrangement, not just because it helps me keep the ranch, but because I think you are someone worth knowing." Grace felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had spent so long being judged and dismissed that having someone see her for who she really was and appreciate it felt almost overwhelming. "Thank you, James," she said softly. "That means more than you know." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Grace realized that something was shifting between them. They had started as strangers forced together by circumstance, but they were becoming something else. Friends, perhaps. Or maybe the beginnings of something more, though Grace was afraid to name it. 2 weeks after their midnight wedding, Grace hosted her first poker game at the ranch. She had spread the word through Pete at the saloon, and 6 men showed up on Saturday evening, ready to play. James stayed out of the way, working in the barn, but his presence nearby made Grace feel safer than she ever had running games in town. The night went well. The men were respectful, knowing they were in Grace's home now and that her husband was just outside. Grace won consistently, as she usually did, but she made sure no one lost so badly that they would leave angry. By the end of the night, she had increased her savings considerably and established that poker nights at the Yates ranch were going to be a regular occurrence. After the last player left, James came inside and found Grace counting her winnings at the kitchen table. "How did it go?" he asked. "Very well," Grace said with satisfaction. "I made more tonight than I usually make in 3 nights at the saloon, and without any fights or trouble." "Thank you for letting me do this." "It is your home too," James reminded her. "You do not need my permission to use it as you see fit." But Grace noticed the way he said "your home" and felt something flutter in her chest. When had she started thinking of this place as home? When had she started looking forward to James's company, to their evening conversations, to the quiet partnership they had built? The answer came to her slowly over the following days. It had been happening all along, so gradually that she had not noticed until it was already done. She cared about James Yates. She cared about his smile, his kindness, his quiet strength. She cared about the way he treated her as an equal, the way he listened to her opinions, the way he never made her feel small or insignificant. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization terrified her. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, temporary and practical. Falling in love had not been part of the deal. But Grace could not deny what she was feeling, and she found herself watching James with new eyes, noticing the way his face lit up when he laughed, the gentleness in his hands when he tended to an injured calf, the way he always made sure she had enough to eat before he took his own portion. Grace knew she should probably say something, but fear held her back. What if James did not feel the same way? What if he still saw this as purely transactional? She could not bear the thought of making things awkward between them, or, worse, having him feel obligated to pretend feelings he did not have. So she kept quiet and tried to act as though nothing had changed, even as her heart beat a little faster every time James smiled at her. The first Saturday in September, James asked Grace to come into town with him for supplies. They rode in together on the wagon, sitting side by side on the bench, and Grace was acutely aware of the warmth of his leg against hers, the casual way he rested one hand on his knee while the other held the reins. Challis was busy with weekend activity, people going about their shopping and socializing. Grace noticed the stares and whispers that followed them as they walked down the main street, but she held her head high and kept her hand tucked into the crook of James's arm. They stopped at the general store first, where the proprietor greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Mr. and Mrs. Yates, good to see you both. "What can I help you with today?" James rattled off a list of supplies while Grace browsed the shelves, looking at fabrics and household goods. She was surprised when James came up behind her and said quietly, "Pick out something nice for yourself. Consider it a gift." "James, you do not have to do that," Grace protested. "I know," he said, "but I want to. You have been working hard on the ranch and you deserve something special." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. No one had given her a gift in years, not since her father had been alive and occasionally remembered her birthday. She ran her fingers over a length of dark blue calico, imagining it made into a new dress. "This," she said finally, "if you are certain." "I am certain," James said, and he smiled at her in a way that made her knees feel weak. After they finished at the general store, they went to the hotel restaurant for dinner, as had become their Saturday routine. They were shown to a table by the window, and Grace noticed that Sheriff Mitchell was sitting across the room, watching them with undisguised hostility. "He still has not forgiven us for outsmarting him," Grace murmured. "Let him stew," James replied. "He cannot do anything about it now. You are a respectable married woman, and he has no grounds to run you out of town." Their dinner arrived, roast beef and potatoes with gravy, and they ate while talking quietly about the ranch and their plans for the coming winter. Grace found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of a good meal and pleasant company. As they were finishing, a well-dressed man approached their table. He was middle-aged with thinning hair and cold eyes that assessed Grace like she was a piece of property. "James Yates," the man said. "I heard you had gotten married. Quite the surprise." "Challis," James said flatly. "Grace, this is Challis Cortland. Challis, my wife Grace." So this was the man who wanted to take the ranch. Grace studied him carefully and decided she did not like him at all. "Charming," Challis said, though his tone suggested he found her anything but. "I must say, this was a clever move on your part, James. Marrying just in time to meet the terms of your uncle's will. Some might say it was suspiciously convenient." "Some might say a lot of things," James replied evenly. "But the fact remains that I am married, which means the ranch is mine. You might as well stop hoping otherwise." Challis's expression hardened. "We will see about that. I have a lawyer looking into the terms of the will. If there is any way to contest it, I will find it." "You do that," James said. "But I suggest you not waste your money. The marriage is legal, witnessed by a preacher and recorded with the territorial government. There is nothing to contest." Challis glared at them both, then turned and walked away without another word. Grace let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "He is not going to give up easily, is he?" she said. "No," James admitted. "Challis is not the type to accept defeat gracefully, but there is nothing he can do as long as our marriage holds up." "As long as our marriage holds up," Grace repeated, and the words felt heavier than they should have. Their marriage was supposed to be temporary just until the September deadline passed. But what then? Would James want to end it? Would she? Grace realized with a start that she did not want the marriage to end. She wanted to stay with James, not because of a legal arrangement, but because she had found something with him that she had never expected to find. A partnership, yes, but also companionship and understanding and the fragile beginnings of love. But she still did not know if he felt the same way, and the uncertainty was eating at her. September 15th arrived with clear blue skies and a crispness in the air that promised autumn was on its way. Grace woke early and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what this date meant. As of today, James had met the terms of his uncle's will. The ranch was legally his, no matter what Challis Cortland tried to do, which meant that their arrangement had served its purpose. Grace got up and dressed, her movements mechanical. She found James already up and making coffee as he always did. He looked up when she entered and smiled, but there was something uncertain in his expression. "Good morning," he said. "Happy September 15th. Is it?" Grace asked, sitting down at the table. "Happy, I mean." James poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table, sitting across from her. "Grace, we need to talk." Grace's heart sank. Here it came. He was going to tell her that the arrangement was over, that she could stay on the ranch if she wanted or leave if she preferred, but either way, the marriage had served its purpose, and now it was time to move on. "I know," she said quickly, wanting to get it over with. "You met the deadline and you do not need to be married anymore. I understand. I can pack my things and be out of your way by tomorrow." James looked startled. "What? No, that is not what I was going to say at all." Grace blinked. "It is not." "No." James reached across the table and took her hand, and Grace felt electricity shoot up her arm at the contact. "Grace, these past few weeks have been the best of my life. I know we started this as a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being just that for me. I do not want you to leave. I do not want this to end. I want us to have a real marriage if you will have me." Grace stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "You want a real marriage, with me?" "Yes," James said firmly. "I know I am not much of a catch. I am just a cowboy with a modest ranch and more debts than savings. But I can promise you that I will work hard every day to build a good life for us. And I can promise that I will respect you and cherish you and never try to change who you are. Because I have fallen in love with you, Grace. Completely and irrevocably in love with you." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to say it, afraid that you would not feel the same way, that this was still just business for you. It stopped being business the moment you made me laugh that first night," James said, standing and pulling her to her feet. "It stopped being business when I saw how brave you were, how strong and smart and beautiful. You are everything I never knew I wanted, Grace Yates." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a real kiss this time, not the chaste peck they had exchanged at their wedding. Grace melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly safe. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "So you will stay. We can make this a real marriage." "Yes," Grace said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will stay. I will stay forever if you will have me." "Forever sounds perfect," James murmured, and he kissed her again. The weeks that followed were the happiest Grace had ever known. She and James moved into the same bedroom, and their partnership deepened into a true marriage in every sense of the word. They worked together during the day and held each other at night, and Grace marveled at how natural it all felt. The poker games continued, now with James sometimes joining in. He was not as skilled as Grace, but he was a quick learner, and she enjoyed teaching him her strategies. The games became social events, with Grace serving refreshments and the players often staying late to talk and laugh. News of their love story spread through Challis and the surrounding ranches. The tale of the woman who had been ordered to leave town and the cowboy who had married her at midnight became local legend, and Grace found that people's attitudes toward her had softened. She was no longer the scandalous woman running gambling games. She was Mrs. Yates, the charming wife of a hard-working rancher who happened to be very good at cards. Silas Cortland made one last attempt to contest the will, claiming the marriage was fraudulent, but Reverend Paulson testified on their behalf, along with several townspeople who had seen them together. The judge dismissed the case without hesitation, and Silas was ordered to pay court costs. Grace heard through Pete that Silas had left Challis shortly after, moving his business interests to Montana, where he hoped to have better luck. Winter came, blanketing the ranch in snow and forcing Grace and James to spend long evenings inside by the fire. They would read together, or James would play the harmonica he kept tucked away in his room, or they would simply talk for hours about everything and nothing. Grace learned about James's childhood, about the parents he had lost to cholera when he was young, about his dreams of building the ranch into something his uncle would have been proud of. James learned about Grace's years of wandering, about the loneliness she had endured and the walls she had built around her heart to protect herself. He held her when she cried for the girl she had been and the opportunities she had missed, and he promised her that from now on, she would never be alone again. In the spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, the same place where they had first started to become friends. "We are going to have a baby," she said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. James's face lit up with joy. "Truly, Grace, that is wonderful." "Are you happy about it?" "I am terrified," Grace admitted. "But yes, I am happy. I never thought I would have a family, never thought anyone would want to build a life with me. And now I have you, and soon we will have a child. It feels like a dream." "It is not a dream," James assured her, pulling her close. "It is real, and it is ours, and we are going to be wonderful parents." Their son was born in November, a healthy boy with dark hair and his father's brown eyes. They named him Thomas after James's uncle, and Grace had never known love like what she felt the first time she held her son in her arms. James was a devoted father, taking to the role with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He would walk Thomas around the ranch, pointing out the cattle and the horses and the mountains in the distance, telling the baby stories about his great uncle and the legacy he had left behind. Grace thrived as a mother, though she also continued her poker games. She had found a balance between the domestic role society expected of her and the independent spirit that defined who she was. James never asked her to choose between being a wife and mother and being herself. He understood that she could be all of those things at once. Over the years, the ranch prospered. James's hard work and Grace's savvy management of their finances allowed them to expand the herd and improve the property. They built a new barn and added rooms to the house, anticipating the growth of their family. Thomas was joined by a daughter 2 years later, a bright-eyed girl they named Ruth after Grace's mother. And 3 years after that, another son arrived whom they called Samuel. The house that had once felt empty and lonely was now filled with the sounds of children laughing and running through the rooms. Grace looked back on that night in August 1882, when Sheriff Mitchell had posted his eviction notice, and marveled at how much had changed. She had been so certain that being forced to leave Challis would be the end of everything, but instead, it had been the beginning. The beginning of a love she had never expected, a family she had never dared to dream of, and a life that exceeded her wildest hopes. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised her with a trip back to the church where they had been married. Reverend Paulson was still there, older and more frail, but still performing his duties. James asked him to renew their vows, and this time when they spoke the words "until death do us part," Grace knew they meant every syllable. "You ever regret it?" James asked her that night as they lay in bed, the sounds of their sleeping children drifting through the walls. "Marrying me that night instead of just leaving town." Grace turned to face him, tracing the familiar lines of his face with her fingertips. "Not for a single moment. You saved me, James, not just from being run out of town, but from a life of loneliness and wandering. You gave me a home and a family and a love I never thought I deserved." "You deserved all of it and more," James said firmly. "You are the strongest, bravest, most incredible woman I have ever known. I am the one who should be grateful. You took a chance on a desperate cowboy with nothing to offer but a run-down ranch and a marriage of convenience, and you turned it into something beautiful. We turned it into something beautiful, Grace corrected. Together. Together, James agreed, and he kissed her, soft and sweet and filled with a decade's worth of love and devotion. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. They lost a cattle herd to disease one year and had to rebuild from almost nothing. Grace's poker games provided crucial income during that difficult time, and she took pride in knowing that her skills had helped save their ranch. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated births and mourned deaths, and through it all, their love remained constant and true. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Ruth inherited her mother's sharp mind and fierce independence, declaring at 15 that she planned to attend college back east and become a teacher. Samuel was the dreamer of the family, always sketching the landscape and talking about becoming an artist. Grace and James supported all three of their children's ambitions, determined to give them the opportunities and choices they themselves had never had. On the 20th anniversary of that midnight wedding, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Thomas was 21 now and courting a rancher's daughter from the next valley. Ruth was 18 and preparing to leave for school in Boston. Samuel was 15 and had just sold his first painting to a gallery in Boise. Grace looked around at her children, at James, who still made her heart flutter after 2 decades together, at the life they had built from nothing but desperation and hope, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered to James as they stood on the porch watching their children play with the new foal that had been born that spring. "For what?" James asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "For taking a chance on me," Grace said. "For seeing past the scandal and the gossip to the woman underneath. For giving me a reason to stay." James pulled her closer. "You gave me just as much, Grace. Before you, I was going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. You brought color and laughter and passion into my world. You made this ranch into a home. I am the one who should be thanking you." "Then let us call it even," Grace suggested with a smile. "Even," James agreed. They stood there together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Grace thought about the scared young woman she had been, standing in that saloon 20 years ago, listening to the sheriff order her out of town. She thought about the desperate decision to marry a stranger, the fear and uncertainty of those first days, and the slow, beautiful unfolding of love that had followed. If she could go back and tell that young woman what the future held, she would hardly believe it. But that was the magic of life, Grace reflected. You never knew when everything was about to change. You never knew when a midnight wedding born of desperation would turn into a love story for the ages. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, James took Grace's hand and led her inside where their children were setting the table for dinner. The house was warm and filled with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. This was her life now, her real life, the one she had chosen and fought for and cherished. And it had all started with a cowboy brave enough to propose marriage at midnight to a woman he barely knew, all so she could stay. Years continued to roll by like the seasons changing across the Idaho landscape. Grace turned 45, then 50, and found that age suited her. Her hair had strands of silver threaded through the dark, and fine lines had appeared around her eyes. But James still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Thomas had married his sweetheart and built a house on the northern section of the ranch, raising his own family there. He and James worked the land together, father and son side by side, and Grace loved watching them collaborate with such easy affection. Thomas's wife, Mary, was a sweet woman who reminded Grace of herself at that age, determined and capable despite her gentle demeanor. They had given Grace and James 4 grandchildren who ran wild across the ranch, filling it with even more life and laughter. Ruth had indeed gone to Boston for college and had become a teacher, just as she had planned. But she had returned to Idaho after 5 years, declaring that while she loved teaching, she loved the West more. She opened a school in Challis, the first proper schoolhouse the town had ever had, and taught children from all the surrounding ranches. She never married, declaring that she was perfectly content with her independence, and Grace understood that choice in a way that perhaps only another woman who had fought for her own autonomy could. Samuel had moved to San Francisco to pursue his art, but he came home every summer and filled the ranch house with his paintings. He had made a modest name for himself painting landscapes of the American West, and his work hung in galleries from California to New York. He had recently gotten engaged to a fellow artist, a woman named Catherine, who James and Grace had met and instantly loved. Grace still hosted poker games occasionally, though less frequently than in her younger years. She had earned a reputation as one of the best card players in the territory, and men would sometimes travel from neighboring towns just for the chance to sit at her table. The money she earned went into a fund she had established to help women in difficult circumstances, women like she had once been who needed a little help to get on their feet. James had expanded the ranch to nearly 500 acres, making it one of the most successful operations in the valley. But he always said that his greatest accomplishment was not the land or the cattle or the money, but the family he had built with Grace. On quiet evenings, he would still pull out his harmonica and play while Grace sat beside him, her hand in his, and they would remember that midnight wedding and marvel at where life had taken them. On a warm summer evening in 1907, 25 years after that desperate night when everything had changed, Grace and James sat on their porch surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Thomas's youngest son, a rambunctious 5-year-old named James after his grandfather, climbed into Grace's lap and asked her to tell him a story. "What kind of story?" Grace asked, smoothing down his unruly hair. "A love story," the boy said decisively. "Mama says you and Grandpa have the best love story ever." Grace glanced at James, who was watching her with amusement and tenderness. "Did she now?" "Yes. She said you got married at midnight so you could stay in town and then you fell in love for real. Is that true?" "It is true," Grace confirmed, "though the story is a bit more complicated than that." "Tell me," the boy demanded, and soon all the other grandchildren had gathered around, eager to hear the tale. So Grace told them, with James occasionally interjecting details or corrections. She told them about being ordered to leave Challis, about James's unexpected proposal, about their midnight wedding and the deal they had struck. She told them about learning to work together, about slowly falling in love, about the fears and hopes and dreams that had shaped their journey. "But were not you scared?" one of the older grandchildren asked. "Marrying someone you did not even know." "Terrified," Grace admitted. "But sometimes the scariest choices turn out to be the best ones. Your grandfather took a chance on me when no one else would, and I took a chance on him. And look what came from that leap of faith." She gestured to all of them, the children and grandchildren, the ranch spread out before them, the life they had built together. "Will I find a love like that?" young James asked seriously. Grace hugged him close. "I hope you find exactly the love you need when you need it most. That is what your grandfather and I found. Not the love we expected, but the love that saved us both." As the evening wore on and the children were called away to bed, Grace and James were left alone on the porch once more, just as they had been so many times over the past 25 years. The moon was rising, nearly full just as it had been that August night in 1882. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just left town that night?" James asked quietly. "If you had packed your things and ridden out before sunrise?" Grace considered the question. "Sometimes. I suppose I would have ended up in another town, running poker games until someone ran me out of there too. I would have survived, I always did. But I would not have lived, not really. Not the way I have lived with you." "I would have lost the ranch," James said. "Silas would have gotten it, and I would have been just another failed cowboy drifting from job to job. I needed you, Grace, not just for the marriage clause in the will, but for everything that came after. You made me believe in myself again." "We saved each other," Grace said simply. "That is what real love does. It does not complete you because you were never incomplete, but it gives you the courage to be who you truly are." James stood and offered her his hand. "Dance with me." "There is no music," Grace pointed out, but she took his hand anyway. "We will make our own," James said, and he began to hum a waltz they had danced to at Thomas's wedding. So they danced on the porch under the rising moon. Two people who had started as strangers bound by necessity and had become partners bound by love. Grace rested her head on James's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years after that evening continued to be full and rich. Grace and James watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated Ruth's decision to finally marry at 52 to a widowed rancher who appreciated her independence, and welcomed Samuel and Catherine's twin daughters into the family. They dealt with the changing times as automobiles began to appear on the roads, and the wild west of their youth slowly transformed into something more civilized and less wild. Grace's poker fund for women in need grew substantially, helped along by donations from some of the men she had beaten over the years, who had developed respect for her abilities. She became known not just as a card player, but as a philanthropist, and several young women credited her with giving them the help they needed to start new lives. James's health began to fail in his late 60s, a combination of decades of hard physical labor and a heart that had worked too hard for too long. Grace tended to him with fierce devotion, refusing to let him see how scared she was. They had always known that one of them would have to face the world without the other eventually, but knowing it intellectually and facing it emotionally were two very different things. On a cool October morning in 1912, 30 years after their midnight wedding, James passed away peacefully in his sleep with Grace holding his hand. He was 68 years old and had lived to see his ranch thrive, his children succeed, and his grandchildren grow into fine young people. His last words to Grace had been, "Thank you for staying." Grace mourned him deeply, as did everyone who had known him. The funeral brought people from all over the territory, ranchers and townspeople and card players and business associates, all coming to pay their respects to a good man who had lived his life with integrity and kindness. Grace stood at the graveside with her children on either side of her and felt the weight of loss settle into her bones. But she also felt gratitude. Gratitude for 30 years of love and partnership, for the family they had created, for the life they had shared. Some people lived 80 years and never experienced a fraction of the joy she had known with James. She had been blessed, and she knew it. Grace lived another 15 years after James's passing, remaining active and engaged with her family and community until the very end. She continued to host poker games occasionally, more for the social aspect than for the money, and she expanded her charitable work to include a scholarship fund for young women who wanted to attend college but lacked the means. She spent long hours on the porch of the ranch house, the same porch where she and James had courted and danced and grown old together. And she would talk to him sometimes, telling him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren he was missing, about the changes happening in the world, about how much she missed him but how grateful she was for the time they had shared. On a spring morning in 1927, Grace passed away in her sleep at the age of 70. She was surrounded by photographs of her family, and on the nightstand beside her bed was the marriage certificate from that midnight wedding, carefully preserved and framed. Thomas found it there and understood that, even after all these years, his mother had treasured that moment when her life had changed forever. They buried Grace next to James on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Grace Yates, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She stayed." And beneath those words, added by Ruth, who understood her mother better than anyone, "She loved fiercely and lived freely." The ranch passed to Thomas, and then to his children, continuing as a family operation for generations. But the story of how it had all begun, the tale of the woman who had been ordered to leave town and the cowboy who had married her at midnight so she could stay, became family legend. It was told and retold at gatherings, embellished and romanticized but always true at its core. A story about two desperate people who had taken a chance on each other and found something neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed: love, partnership, home. The poker table Grace had used for her games was kept in the family, eventually becoming an antique that Grace's great-great-grandchildren would marvel at, unable to quite believe that their proper ancestor had once been a scandalous woman running gambling operations and defying social conventions. But Ruth, who lived to be 93, would set them straight, telling them that their great-great-grandmother had been ahead of her time, a woman who had refused to let society's limitations define her. And she would tell them about James, too, about the cowboy who had been secure enough in himself to appreciate a strong woman, who had offered marriage not as a cage but as a door to freedom, who had understood that love was not about possession but about partnership. The marriage certificate, the poker table, and dozens of photographs became treasured family heirlooms, passed down through the generations along with the story. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, descendants of Grace and James would stand on that same porch and look out over the ranch that had started it all, and they would feel the presence of their ancestors, two people who had beaten the odds and built something extraordinary from the most unlikely of beginnings. Because, in the end, that midnight wedding had not just saved Grace from being run out of town, or helped James keep his inheritance. It had been the foundation for a love story that would echo through generations, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on a stranger, from being brave enough to stay when it would be easier to run, from believing that two people who barely know each other can, against all odds, build something beautiful together. The town of Challis, Idaho grew and changed over the decades, but the story remained. Old-timers would point out the church where the marriage had taken place, the saloon where it had all begun, the road that led out to the Yates ranch. They would tell visitors about Grace and James, about the midnight wedding and the love that had followed, and their eyes would grow soft with nostalgia for a time when the West was still wild and anything seemed possible. And perhaps on certain moonlit nights when the wind blew just right across the Idaho hills, if you stood very quietly on that porch, you could almost hear the sound of a harmonica playing and the soft laughter of two people who had found each other in the darkness and had chosen to stay together until the very end. It was a love story for the ages, born from desperation but sustained by devotion, started at midnight but lasting through all the days and nights that followed. Grace had been ordered to leave town by sunrise, and a cowboy had married her at midnight so she could stay. But what had begun as a practical solution to an immediate problem had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. A partnership that had weathered every storm, a love that had deepened with every passing year, and a legacy that would inspire their descendants for generations to come. In the end, Grace had not just stayed in Challis. She had put down roots so deep that they could never be torn up, had built a family so strong that it would endure long after she was gone, and had loved so completely that even death could not diminish it. And James had given her all of that, with a single impulsive proposal on a desperate night when both of them had needed a miracle. They had been each other's miracles, and their love had been the greatest gift either of them had ever received. A gift that kept on giving long after they were gone, in the lives of the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their story forward into the future. The ranch house still stood on that hill in Idaho, weathered by time but sturdy and strong, a testament to what two people could build when they chose to stay, to fight, to love. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear the echoes of their story whispered on the wind, a tale of courage and chance and a midnight wedding that had changed everything. She was ordered to leave town by sunrise. A cowboy married her at midnight so she could stay. And in staying, they had both found something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth cherishing until their very last breaths. They had found each other, and that had made all the difference.